Hi, everyone, and welcome to Mex Moves, a weekly podcast dissecting businesses in Mexico and some other related topics. For this episode, we have a full lineup. We will hear later a very interesting conversation with Andrey Zarur, the Mexican founder of GreenLight Biosciences, a biotech startup doing great and very interesting things using RNA to transform agriculture, from fighting crop diseases to replacing chemical pesticides. Zarur is betting that biology, not petrochemicals, is the future of farming. So wait and listen. It's a very interesting conversation. We will also talk about remittances and the tax the U.S. intends to put, or at least some legislators are pretending to implement. Also, we'll talk about Nissan cutting production in some other countries, and Mexico in particular. And Damien and I went to different events. He went to the Council of the Americas, where Marcelo Ebrard spoke, and I went to an event organized by Cuatro Casas, a law firm, regarding foreign investment in Mexico. So we have a full plate for you today. Damien, why don't you start if you want?
Sure, Eduardo. How are you? Everything good?
Everything okay? How's everything?
Yeah. So why don't we start with Nissan, and then we can move to remittances, and then we can move to our different events that we went to this week. As you probably saw, Eduardo, there were some media reports that Nissan might close some plants in Mexico, Japan, and Argentina. As soon as those reports appeared, Nissan then said that the reports were speculative, emphasizing that there was no confirmation about such closures. They didn't, as far as I know, specifically deny them. They just said that they were speculative. As we all know, Nissan, was trying to, it has several different sort of problems. One, it was trying to merge with Honda, and that was called off. And that merger with Honda was, part of an effort to streamline and improve its efficiency. And then in addition to that, like every automaker, Nissan is vulnerable to the tariffs that the US is putting on exporters to the US, because it's a big exporter to the US. So, and unfortunately for Mexico, most of its exports to the US come from Mexico. So basically, Nissan produced, I believe, 670,000 vehicles in Mexico, and exports over 450,000 units in total. And of those 450,000 units, 320,000, went to the United States. So roughly half its production in Mexico goes to the US. It has these plants, these three plants in Mexico. The Morelos plant, that's almost as old as I am. It was established in 1966. And it was its first plant outside Japan. And then it has two big plants in Aguascalientes, the 1992 plant, which I've actually been to, and that produces the Versa, the Kicks, the March, has a capacity of about 400,000 and employs, I think, about 7,000 people. Then it has another more recent plant, 20 years old, which produces the Sentra model with a 250,000 capacity. Overall, Nissan it's a big employer in Mexico, 16,000 people. What's ironic about the potential, and I repeat, potential closures in Mexico, which we hope doesn't happen, is that they, just as we mentioned in a previous podcast, they just appointed a Mexican global CEO, Ivan Espinosa, in April of this year. This is the first time a Mexican has led a major global automaker. He's been at Nissan for over 20 years. Nissan's also, like all the traditional car makers in Mexico that sell locally, also faced competition from the Chinese automobile companies, which has hurt its sales here, because Nissan has long been the number one car seller in Mexico. Pre-COVID, its market share was over 20%. It's now down to about 17% or so, and over that time period, the Chinese automobile companies have grown their total market share of the Mexican market to 20%, basically share from everyone else. As their cars, generally speaking, are cheaper, and at least when you look at them, They look very smart and very good and told they drive quite well. So that's disappointing news. And, I think it's a result of Nissan's own issues, to the extent
Right.
that this is confirmed, and also, the concerns about tariffs. In fact, the CEO of Nissan, the outgoing CEO in the earnings conference call, said, that Nissan might have to move production to the US to avoid these tariffs.
I guess it's not necessarily a Mexico-related issue per se, but it's without a doubt something to be worried because of the number of people that you mentioned work in the factories they have in the country. But if the company was already facing troubled times, Donald Trump has obviously not helped. And we'll have to wait and see what the end result is. Maybe they can shift some of that export production to South America, where I guess some of those cars could fit in, and wait to see what the new CEO, which fortunately is Mexican, might do or not do. I mean, obviously, nationalities at such levels don't matter. You have to look for efficiency and what the best mix of production lines works for your company. But it's something that's been talked about for a few months now. Nothing surprising there, but it seems to confirm the worst. Let's hope it doesn't materialize.
And the civic plant in Morelos, where I think the incoming CEO worked at one point, is almost, next year will be 60 years old.
It's a very old plant, yeah.
It's not that efficient at this point, so it might be vulnerable just based on its age. And it obviously makes sense in general terms to consolidate production, in fewer, bigger, more efficient plants. So there may be part of that, maybe what's going on. And when you're doing things like that, it often is useful from a sort of PR perspective, to blame Trump, as it were. But there may be things that you were going to do anyway, right?
Right. Yeah. I've always learned about that plant in Morelos, CIVAC. When you went to that part of the Cuernavaca city, that was a point of reference, let's put it that way. But yeah, that's an old plant. I guess it has been refurbished, but maybe it can be saved in current modern terms.
So, rather moving on to remittances, what do you make of this potential 5% tax on non-US residents that are making the remittances?
Well, it's a proposal that is not coming from Trump himself. It's coming from a legislator. Now, I've heard already that, I read that some Latino legislators from both parties are not happy with the proposal. I don't think it collects a lot of money for the U.S. in terms of the needs that they need. So I'm hoping that it doesn't go through. I think the way the Mexican government has presented the case is the right way, in the sense that they are politically pressuring the administration not to approve that measure. But obviously there is very little they can do to avoid it. But there is a double taxation treaty that Mexico has signed, or that the U.S. has signed with Mexico, which could give those that send remittances, not just to Mexico, but to Guatemala, El Salvador, India, all of these countries, they might have a legal case, to say that they're being double taxed. Now, how long will that take in case the proposal goes through? It's hard to know. I don't know how expedient the justice system works in America, but obviously they can file an injunction and suspend the measure as they review it. I hope it doesn't go through. It doesn't make a lot of sense. It just creates animosity between the two countries. And it will have, if it does, it will have an impact on Mexico much larger than the benefits the U.S. would get from it, I would suspect. I mean, if we're talking about $60 billion of remittances per year, a little bit more, a 5% tax of that would be $3 billion, which is a lot of money for the people that receive it in this country. The spread of purchasing that it represents for a lot of companies in the country, in the areas where those remittances are transferred to. But for the U.S., I think $3 billion is nothing in terms of what Trump is aiming at doing in tax cuts and then spending cuts, allegedly, although it seems like the budget deficit of the U.S. will grow. That's why Moody's downgraded the U.S. rating. My expectation is that it won't go through, but I think the government has done the right thing to put political pressure on it. The companies should put political pressure on it. Walmart and all those other companies that have interest in Mexico should put pressure, and then use the legal system to try to avoid this from happening.
Yeah, and I think actually the impact will be a lot less, even if it does happen. It applies as it's currently written to non-US nationals, but a lot of the Mexicans that are sending the
Are
money
already nationals.
are nationals. So it probably less than I've seen some Wall Street research that suggests less than a third of the total remittances, which over the last 12 months actually climbed to about $69 billion, could be, affected. But then on top of, so that only leaves you with, if that's true, 18 billion or so coming from non-nationals. But on top of that, people will obviously try to avoid it using black market channels or asking their brother or their best friend or their children in some case to send the money who are nationals. So they will avoid the tax. So what you'll start getting is people moving money between each other in the US, cash or transfers, and then the person who is the US national making the transfer. So the actual financial impact is probably relatively small. I think what it might do is, I don't think the goal here, because the amounts of money are so small relative to the US total tax revenues, it's more about trying to make life difficult for non-documented migrants, and it might make it more difficult for them, which is, I think, what maybe their objective is. But on the other hand, it will also make transfers a lot less transparent as people try to avoid the tax. And that will have a series of negative repercussions, in terms of tracking down sort of money laundering and, know your customer. If people are making transfers on behalf of other people, will be much more challenging. So it might make life a little bit more difficult for certain migrants, probably not that much more difficult. But on the other hand, it will have a series of other consequences, which will be quite negative. And financially, it's basically irrelevant when you're talking about deficits of and total debt levels of trillions of dollars.
Correct.
So tell me, Eduardo, about the Cuatro Casas event. I was sorry to miss it.
It was quite interesting, mainly focused on foreign investment in Mexico. Where were we standing? The figures, we had an official from the economy ministry, the director of foreign investment. He said that tomorrow we will get the first quarter numbers for foreign direct investment in Mexico, and he was positive. We've seen it slow down over the past few quarters, mainly in terms of the content that is of new investment. And at the same time, Emilio Cadena, who is the CEO of Grupo Prodensa, a foreign investment promoter, he spoke that while at the beginning of the year, with all the uncertainty, his phone stopped ringing for potential deals, he has started listening again to some calls that indicate that even though there are still a lot of things that haven't settled down, there's still a lot of dust in the air, that things are beginning to restart in terms of looking for industrial parks, setting up shop in different parts of the country. So he was quite optimistic. He also, like our guest last week, is quite encouraged by the Plan Mexico in terms of having clear and good objectives of where Mexico might become a powerhouse in terms of its advantages versus other areas. But he also had a criticism of the plan in terms that it doesn't contain any financial structure that will support all these very ambitious goals. And he obviously thinks that one of the great pockets of money that the country has are the Afores. They need to be guaranteed that the investments will be there, that they are good projects, that they can't give workers a great return in the future. So he was coming with the idea that there needs to be a better coordination between what Plan Mexico aims to do and how it will be financed so that it becomes a reality. Obviously, the Mexican government doesn't have the resources to finance many of the ambitious goals the plan contains, but he thinks that there are resources in the country that could do so. Also, they talked about the lack of strategic planning on things that Mexico could be doing that are done somewhere else in Asia, like PC boards or any of these microcircuits that are done elsewhere. And Mexico, they said, has zero of that, and that we have the engineers, the talent, and the capacity to do so. So hopefully they will come to terms and address those issues. Five elements that worries those that spoke in the panel are transportation costs. Mexico has very high transportation costs. Sometimes suppliers in Ciudad Juarez rather get their supplies from Ohio than from the state of Mexico because of cost. The IVA, the speed at which the IVA is returned to factories or manufacturers in Mexico is quite slow. They should accelerate that process. Energy is crucial. We don't have enough talent. Promoting greater engineers, educating people that could do these technological jobs is crucial. And the rule of law. With the judicial reform, there are great doubts about where we're standing. June 1st is the election day of half of the judicial members. That's a big question mark, how it will work. And we will have to be ready to correct if it didn't work out, which most people predict it won't. It was a positive but practical outlook on how Mexico could encourage foreign investment at a speedier way. They also talked about that Hacienda should just forget about collecting taxes if a micro plant or a microchip plant wants to come in and set up shop in Mexico. That's a technology that we don't have. Let's forget about collecting anything. Let's bring them in and then think about probably collecting taxes. So that's the overall picture that I guess we had. Then there was a more technical element of how the US and Europe regulate foreign investment. But that's a much more technical aspect. That's a bit more for those that are in the regulatory framework.
So Ebrard, in the Council of the Americas event, Eduardo, he touched, I guess, on a lot of the same issues. Clearly, he was more positive, as he's paid to be. I mean, I came away, first of all, very happy that Ebrard is the economy minister and responsible for trade talks with the US. I think he's the best positioned person in the current cabinet to do that. He's got a lot of experience. He understands trade. He obviously negotiated back in 2016 with Trump. So I think we're in quite good hands. I mean, his message was that the US is now prioritizing reducing its trade deficit with Asia, especially with China. That's the new rule of the game, whether we like it or not. And as a result of that, his argument is that North America needs to shift to a regional economy, importing less from Asia and building integration between Mexico, the US, and Canada. And that Mexico, therefore, needs to replace a lot of the production that was done out of Asia, and Plan Mexico dovetails into that. And he sort of said that the fact that USMCA compliant products remain tariff-free is evidence that that's where things are going. He also announced that that effectively Mexico will be paying about 15% tariffs on car exports to the US, which have their own separate agreement, basically because the US component in the car value added is going to be tariff-free. So, and there's certain sort of complex hoops that car companies have to go through, but that basically means that Mexican exports of cars are going to be paying half the tariff of car exports from anywhere else. And that because Mexico is a lot more competitive from a cost perspective than the US, still makes sense to produce out of Mexico. And obviously car parts are also from Mexico, also exempt from tariffs, which is not true of the rest of the world, except for Canada. So he basically argued that Mexico's in a very strong relative position. The US wants to reduce its deficit with Asia, especially with China, and that plays to Mexico's advantage. He even talked about the government, and I would take this with a pinch of salt, has compiled a portfolio of 2,000 investment projects as part of Plan Mexico, worth 300 billion US, and these are being tracked and categorized. Green, which means they're moving forward. Yellow, they're facing moderate friction, where some government support is needed, and red, where they're stalled, and then the government has to step in and in a very decisive way to get them to happen. But he said that the economy ministry was really trying to focus on removing as much as possible, all these barriers to FDI that you had been talking about. So it was upbeat, as you would imagine, but as I said, the overall impression was a positive one in what is a difficult time for Mexico, not just because of Trump's tariffs, but because of the fiscal adjustment that's going on, and because the uncertainty created by the so-called Plan C constitutional changes is all, as we've talked about before, contributing to basically 0% growth. That said, the peso is very strong. It's up about 7% this year. So clearly, the markets are much more kind of relaxed about Mexico in general, and it's partly because the dollar is weakened against all currencies, but it's partly because the government is embarking on this fiscal adjustment, and I think Sheinbaum has done a pretty good job, and Ebrard and the Edgar Amador of placating kind of private sector concerns, addressing them as much as they can, receiving them, hearing them, talking to them. You're seeing a much more kind of conciliatory and cooperative relationship between the private sector and the public sector than you saw under AMLO.
No doubt. The markets are much more optimistic. The Bolsa has gone up 19% so far this year, and the BIVA index is 17% up. And like you said, the peso has strengthened a little bit. Let's hope both Ebrard and the people I heard are right, always with an optimistic twist. I'm a bit more skeptical on the elements of the Plan C and the damage that is doing to Mexico's credibility. But let's hope also that after the election goes by, could be reviewed and transferred. Shall we go on and move to hear Andrey?
Sounds good. Today we're honored to be joined by Dr. Andrey Zarur, a Mexico City-born scientist and entrepreneur who studied at the UNAM, MIT, Harvard, and founded and leads GreenLight Biosciences, a company pioneering RNA-based biosolutions for sustainable agriculture. GreenLight is tackling one of the world's most urgent crises: how to grow more food with fewer chemicals. As Mexico debates and outlaws, in some cases, the uses of genetically modified organisms, GMOs, Dr. Zarur's RNA-based technologies offer a powerful and highly effective alternative, non-GMO, targeted, and biodegradable. We'll explore what Mexico must do to compete in the bioeconomy, how public policy can help or hinder progress, and why agriculture might be the battlefield where Mexico's scientific potential is decided. Andrey, how are you this morning?
I'm wonderful. Thanks for having us.
Thank you for joining. So, Andrey, you were born and educated in Mexico before moving to the US, to MIT. What does it mean for you personally to be bringing your technology back to transform Mexican agriculture?
Look, I've always had a compromise with Mexico. I've always thought that sooner or later we needed to bring some of this extraordinarily advanced technologies back to Mexico. Mexico could be, should be, and in a way must be one of the most potent engines of the biotransformation economy. It's not a mystery. It's not debatable that we are uncoupling ourselves from the economy of fossil hydrocarbons and moving into an economy that is really reliant on the use of sustainable resources or the sustainable use of the resources that we have. And what that means for Mexico is that we need to shift our focus away from, depending on using the resources of the planet into creating opportunities. And creating opportunities in the bioeconomy really means focusing on the production of food and the protection of the food that we produce. It means making advances in life sciences, including human and animal health. It really means making full use of the potential of the people that we train in Mexico. I think you guys know this. Mexico educates more engineers per capita than any country in the world. Mexico has an extraordinarily illustrious history of educating top-tier scientists that unfortunately then, most of the time, go and practice their science elsewhere. And so, how can we create a vibrant economy that is rooted on the sustainable use of resources that can truly promote Mexico to regain its leadership as a world power on a new stage, the stage of the bioeconomy, which means that we're no longer depleting the resources that are on our planet, but that we figure out a way to sustainably produce those resources that our people need. To come full circle, I studied chemical engineering at UNAM. I think that the School of Chemical Engineering at the National University is among the best in the world. The reason I think that is, when I showed up at MIT, I realized that I was not in any way disadvantaged against people that were coming from some of the top universities in the world, Harvard, Cornell, UCLA, UC Berkeley, whatever. But in fact, that I had received a training and an education that was in many ways superior to what my peers coming into MIT and Harvard had received as undergrads. And that tradition of educating some of the brightest people on the planet still is valid and alive and vibrant at UNAM, at Tech, at Ibero, at so many of the national universities. And so why are we not making better use of that natural resource that we have in Mexico? So, full circle, I want to bring these technologies back to Mexico so that those people that are being trained by some of the top engineers in the world have a way to develop careers that are fulfilling, that are promoting Mexican society in a way that hasn't really been possible over the last 50 years.
Can you talk, Andrey, a little bit about GreenLight as a business, who your investors are, how you make money, where you see the business going forward?
Yeah, look, our industry of producing food through agriculture, which is the industry that we play in, is the largest industry in the world, by far. Some 30% of the world's population is employed in agriculture. If you think like a politician, that's a lot of votes. If you think like an economist, that's a lot of money. It's literally tens of trillions of dollars every single year. And it's one of those industries without which we simply cannot survive. It's pretty obvious to say, right? We cannot survive without agriculture. That's a pretty obvious statement. But if you think about the attention that we provide to other industries like artificial intelligence and mobility and whatever, we can actually live without artificial intelligence. We have done so for hundreds of thousands of years. We can't live without agriculture, period. End of story. And so number one is focusing on figuring out how to return our agricultural industry to a sustainable state. Because the way in which we grow food today is not sustainable. We use more of the earth's resources in producing our food than the resources that we put back into the earth. And so as population continues to grow and the soil and the water and the environment degrades because of our agricultural practices, we need to figure out a way to restore that sustainability or we will run out of food. And history will show you that when peoples run out of food, bad things happen. Wars happen, revolutions happen. And in this time, in this era of our planet, we cannot afford that, right? So we need to restore that sustainability in our food supply. The way in which we grow food is not natural, and it hasn't been natural for tens of thousands of years, right? Crop agriculture is not the natural way of growing food. That should also be pretty obvious, right? We're not gathering berries that fall to the ground. We're plowing a field and putting seeds down and getting a very high concentration of calories in a portion of land. That's not nature. That's a man-made situation. And because it's a man-made situation, it's going to attract pests and diseases that we don't find in nature, right? That's another pretty obvious statement. And therefore, we need to protect those crops. Because if we don't protect them, they get destroyed by pests and by disease. And the way in which we protect those crops historically has been by spraying chemicals. That's the way we've done it, okay? Now, Damien, let's forget for a second about the lack of sustainability of spraying chemicals. It is very unsustainable. It is very environmentally harmful, but let's forget about that for a second, okay? Today, we lose between 30 to 40% of the food that we put on the ground before we have an opportunity to harvest it, before the farmers can regain all the inputs that they put in the land. Those crops get destroyed by pests that can no longer be controlled by chemistry because they've developed resistance against that chemistry. And that resistance is increasing exponentially. So what's our business? Well, our business is to provide farmers with new tools that they absolutely need in order to protect the crops that they grow in order to feed us and our society. That's our business. It's extraordinarily simple. And it's not only because we want to return that sustainability to our planet. It's because the tools that they have today no longer work. And the rate at which those tools are no longer working, the rate of resistance of pests and diseases is increasing far faster than the chemical industry can replace with new products, way faster, okay? So our business is to come up with a new breed of agricultural solutions. In our case, it's based on ribonucleic acid, a natural molecule that is found in nature using natural pathways to stop disease and pests. And we sell those RNAs to farmers that use those RNAs in the same way that they would use a chemical pesticide. They store it in the same way, mix it in the same way, apply it in the same way, and it works just as efficiently as the chemicals that we're replacing. Now, the difference is our products are far safer, are very specific, number one, which means that they only kill the pest that they're intended to kill, and they have no impact or minimal impact on any other non-target species. They have literally zero impact on the environment because RNA is fundamentally biodegradable. And of course, it gets around the resistance that we're seeing so widespread to all those chemical solutions today.
My last question on this, how are you doing? I mean, how are your sales? How's your market share? Is Mexico your priority market around the world? Are you selling in other markets? Just give us a sort of recap of how things are going.
Yeah, so today we have products approved in 3 countries. So we have products approved in the US, we have products approved in Brazil, and we have products approved in Mexico. Actually, 4 countries. We have a product that we rushed through to get approval in Ukraine. It's a product that is very important for Ukrainian farmers because it protects potato crops, which is a major staple of food in Ukraine, against something called a potato beetle, which is a pest that is universal of potato crops. And of course, Ukraine being in the middle of the conflict that they had nothing to do with, they need solutions that they can deploy in their field. So we rushed to get that approval in Ukraine, and we've been shipping product to Ukraine basically philanthropically. But our main markets are indeed the United States, Brazil, and Mexico. How are we doing? We're doing exceptionally well. We're essentially sold out of all of our products. 3 months into the year, we've already sold out our entire inventory for the year. The way in which we're working with Mexico in particular is by working collaboratively both with farmers, with distributors, and working very, very closely with the Mexican government. You know, the Mexican government, this Mexican government is unique. I think it starts with the fact that our president is a scientist. And the thing about being a scientist is once a scientist, always a scientist. And so fact-based, evidence-based data, evidence-based data sets, data coming out of the field, of our field trials, of our greenhouse trials, of our safety profiles, of our analytical chemistry analysis of our products matters. In fact, matters more than what it's mattering in the US right now, where this idea of being data-driven and scientifically driven is kind of being questioned, which is really, really scary. But it is incredibly refreshing to be working with a Mexican government that is data first and science first. And so that's what we're finding at Cofepris and at Senacica, which is just a very fresh, data-driven numbers approach to analyzing our products. You are correct. Mexico has made a number of decisions about genetically modified organisms and genetically modified foods that have less to do with safety and less to do with efficacy and more to do with the cultural heritage of our own crops. And you can judge it any way you want, but I find that to be a valid reason. Corn is corn, and corn is a staple of the Mexican diet and a staple of our Mexican culture that goes back tens of thousands of years, and it's part of our Mexican identity. And the corn that has been used in Mexico more recently, essentially to produce ethanol, is not the corn that we grow. It's not the corn that is profitable for growers. And so it may be more of a political rationale, but it's a data-driven political rationale. What's the downside of not using genetically modified crops? Well, the downside is that you can't use a lot of the conventional chemistries that are designed to work with genetically engineered foods. And therefore, you need new solutions. Now, historically, when you remove the genetically modified organism, then you can't use some of the newer 30-year-old chemistries like glyphosate, and you're relegated to using 50-year-old chemistries that are less safe, that are more harmful to the environment, that are more harmful to human health. And so it's a conundrum, right? Do you stay with genetically modified foods and some of them more recent? Again, they're 30-year-old, so they're not by no means new, but they're newer and safer. By no means new or safe, but newer and safer than the older chemistries that didn't work with genetically modified organisms. So what do? Well, I think what the Mexican government is electing to do is to say, well, there are natural solutions out there, like the GreenLight solutions. Let's give those a chance. Let's evaluate those, again, in a very data-driven scientific way to see if they meet the criteria of preserving our way of growing food, tomatoes, corn, chiles, peppers, strawberries, which are staples not only of our Mexican diet, but of our Mexican culture. And can we try to protect them using natural pathways like RNA and others? So far, that's the approach that we're following with the U.S. government, with the Mexican government. The burden is on us, on GreenLight as the originator, to demonstrate the safety and efficacy of our products, right? So we understand that very, very clearly. What we have asked of the Mexican government, and so far the Mexican government has been incredibly responsive to this, is to provide us with clarity as to how do we best demonstrate that safety and efficacy. I got to tell you, right now, we're getting way more clarity and direction from COFEPRIS and from Senacica and from the other institutions in Mexico than we're getting from the EPA in the US or from the European Union. The evidence that I can tell you so far is that we're getting far better and far clearer directive and direction from Mexico than we're getting from any other country in the world. The exception may be Brazil, but Brazil has a head start over Mexico because Brazil has been embracing these biosolutions for at least a decade. And so they have kind of experience in dealing with these novel solutions and how to analyze their safety and efficacy.
Andrey, obviously you've mentioned corn and potatoes as two crops that I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, which farmers can use your biosolutions to help them. Are there any other products that you're also targeting? How spread could it be?
Right. So the products that we have in the market today protect potatoes. We have the product that is approved in Mexico now is a product that can be used to protect corn, soy, tomatoes, coffee, a number of other crops. We are about to submit a regulatory dossier to COFEPRIS, which is a product that protects honeybees against a parasite called the varroa mite. Honeybees are a fundamental part of the pollination of most of our crops. And so the protection of bee colonies is of paramount importance. The next product that we're going to submit to the Mexican authorities is a fungicide that protects a number of fruits and vegetables against a plant disease called powdery mildew. In Spanish is ascomiceto. It's a type of fungi. It's very difficult to control. It's pernicious in Mexico because Mexico, of course, is warmer and wetter than other geographies. And so fungal pathogens are actually a big part of the problem in Mexico. So we're really excited about that. We expect to have that product submitted in Mexico probably in the third quarter of this year. And then by the end of the year, we'll submit another dossier to COFEPRIS to treat something called ácaros in Spanish, spider mites in English. These ácaros are the main problem that berry growers have in Mexico. They also affect things like tomatoes and apples and other crops. The beauty of our platform is that, RNA is a platform. The chemical composition of RNA is the same for every one of our products, but of course the sequence is different. And so going from one product to the next is just a matter of identifying the gene targets and synthesizing that new molecule.
The fungicide that you mentioned, which crops will that help?
Initially, grapes. And so this is a major problem in our wine producing regions in Mexico. So we're talking to a number of wine producers in El Valle de Guadalupe, in Ensenada, and Baja California. But eventually, it is something that affects growers of some of the more specialty vegetables like cucumbers, like Brussels sprouts, and so on. So a lot of the Bajío growers have problems with this with some of their other crops.
Could you tell us how you came about to develop these bio-natural substances that help farmers grow our food?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very personal story, Eduardo. My career up until the day that I decided to start GreenLight had been focused on solving cancer. And so I had started a number of cancer companies, and I'm still chairman of the board of a breast cancer company. But I had worked in lung cancer, I had worked in ovarian cancer, in leukemia, and a number of other malignancies. That was my training. That's what I did. In 2006, we discovered that our middle son, Alex, was extraordinarily sensitive to residues of chemical pesticides on food. Alex is now a 20-year-old, very healthy kid. But when he was a little boy, it was really scary because some of the foods that you would normally feed a 2-year-old would make him very sick. And we eventually traced this to residues of chemical pesticides on fruits that were making him, pretty sick. What followed that was really a journey of discovery. I knew nothing about our food industry. I grew up in Mexico City, right next to El Periférico. So, my version of a farm was a palm tree that we had in the balcony, right? And I had no idea the kinds of chemicals that were being used to protect our crops and how dangerous some of these chemicals are. Just a few weeks ago, 17 people in India died from exposure to one of those chemical pesticides. 150 people were hospitalized. These aren't safe chemistries. These are chemistries meant to kill. And if they come in contact with humans at the wrong concentration or at the wrong time, they can kill a human. And they have, and they do, almost on a weekly basis, right? And so, as you start looking into this problem, you realize that we can't keep on spraying these extraordinarily dangerous chemicals in our food supply, number one. But then what becomes even more urgent is that a lot of those chemistries simply no longer work. And farmers are losing their crops left and right and going bankrupt because the chemicals just no longer work. Resistance is a real issue. Resistance, that's pests that can no longer be killed by those chemistries. Resistance is increasing exponentially. And this is different because for the first 50 years of the agrochemical industry, we saw a linear increase in resistance. Over the last 20 years, that has shifted from linear to exponential. Now, why is that? Well, it's actually global warming. Global warming is causing an exponential increase in resistance because, simply speaking, the ground no longer gets cold enough during the winter months to kill bugs that have become resistant in the previous generation. And so every new season, we're emerging with bugs that are already resistant. And so we don't start from zero. We start from already. Very similar to antibiotics, except with antibiotics, you didn't used to get this reset. In agriculture, every year we would get a reset because the ground would freeze and all the fungi and bugs that were resistant the previous year would die. And so in a way, we would get a break thanks to the weather. We're no longer getting that break in most of the world, right? I mean, in North Dakota this year, the ground didn't freeze. In North Dakota, I don't know if you guys have been to North Dakota, pretty freaking cold in North Dakota. It didn't freeze this year. And so we emerged with a number of resistant insects and diseases.
So, Andrey, President Trump is trying to decouple the U.S. from China to an important degree, at least. And China is obviously, along with India, an important source of biotech pharmaceutical production for the U.S. market. Do you think Mexico has the capacity to replace?
I'm so glad you asked that question. That's the goal. Yes, China and India are an important source of pharmaceuticals. Yes. They're the sole source of products for the field. They're the sole sources of agricultural products. The vast majority of agrochemical products are produced in China and in India. And if China tomorrow decided, we're just not going to sell you these crop protection products, we would be in a sea of trouble. We, meaning the world, would be in a sea of trouble. So what I want to do is I want to bring the manufacturing of this advanced biologic crop protection products to Mexico. Okay, why to Mexico? For two reasons. The first one, I already told you, we have the most valuable natural resource in the world, which is the Mexican people. Highly trained, highly dedicated, exceptionally smart, insanely hardworking people with experience in biological processing. There's no better place in the world to put a biomanufacturing facility than in Mexico, in my opinion. Okay, number one. Number two, we got to decouple from some of these powers that are friendly when it's convenient to them. What Mexico has that a lot of other countries don't have is that Mexico is friendly. It's an economy that is friendly, that is open, that is willing to help other places. And the U.S. should understand this, right? We are already the main supplier of food to the U.S. We should be one of the main suppliers of ways of protecting that food. It is a no-brainer. And so one of the conversations that we're having with the Mexican government, with Mexican investors, with Mexican universities is establishing GreenLight's facilities for manufacturing, at least for Mexico and certainly for Latin America, but potentially for Asia, for Europe, for Africa, and yes, for the United States in Mexico.
Andrey, I'm surprised that COFEPRIS is the agency you deal with. Excuse me of my ignorance, but I thought it was only for pharmaceutical products. Is your RNA considered a pharmaceutical product, or why do you deal with that?
No, actually, Mexico has it right, just like Europe has it right. COFEPRIS is the agency that regulates both agrochemical products and pharmaceuticals, because, of course, agrochemical products have an impact on human health, and therefore have it all under one umbrella, under the Secretary of Health, makes sense. That is not the way that it is in the U.S. In the U.S., you have the EPA, which is the Environmental Protection Agency, and you have the FDA, which is the Food and Drug Administration, and those two regulate separate things. Now, COFEPRIS does rely on the Secretary of the Environment to do technical assessment on products like ours, right? And that's the role that Senacica plays in ensuring the safety and the efficacy of the products before COFEPRIS can actually approve them.
From what we are talking, and thank you for your very interesting conversation, your products could be used for any crops, if I'm right? I mean, Damien said you're trying to reduce the use of pesticides, but in the end, this could be used for anything and eventually eradicate pesticides. Am I right?
Well, I mean, let's be very clear. Our products are pesticides. They're biological, very specific, extraordinarily safe, friendly with the environment, but nevertheless, they are pesticides. We cannot grow food for 9 billion people without pesticides. That's just a fact, right? If we wanted to grow everything organically, we would need another 7 planets to be able to do so. But yes, eventually we could replace the majority of chemical, dangerous, accumulating, non-specific pesticides with RNA and other technologies, by the way. One of the things that I want to make very, very clear is we're not trying to create a monopoly at all. What we're trying to do is we're trying to open up the field for biological solutions to come into play. And by the way, our platform of discovery of new RNAs is an open source platform. If UNAM wants to use our platform to develop RNA products, they can. And we will help them, and we will promote them, and we will do anything we can to help them commercialize them. Because ultimately, there's trillions of dollars worth of food that needs protecting and tens of billions of dollars of pesticides being used every year. The pie is big enough for a lot of people. And what we need to do is we need to enable, going back to the very first question that you guys asked is, what is the purpose of all this, is to enable the biotransformation in Mexico.
Just one personal question, Andrey. Your son is fine. So you discovered he was affected by this chemical. He couldn't eat the things that he was reacting to. Now you've developed solutions so that people could eat without these problems.
Well, I mean, first of all, he grew up, which, a lot of those things are concentration based. So it's not the same feeding some chemical to a baby than feeding it to a 180-pound, 6-foot-tall 20-year-old, right? So that helped. And he's mostly fine. You still can see some situations. Sometimes he eats some foods and he gets very, very antsy. It's a neurological thing. It's not an allergy thing. And so it affects the way he behaves more than the way he feels, right? And by the way, the person who discovered this was not me, was not the scientist with decades of training, was my wife, who's not a scientist. But as you guys probably know, there's no problem that a really determined mother can't fix. And so that's how we figured out that this kid was being affected by these things.
Great story. Well, congratulations. I mean, it didn't mean that you discovered what was the problem. You're trying to bring a solution, and you control the issues for him so he could grow.
The idea is to control the issues for all the children in the world, because ultimately all these chemicals never go away. They accumulate on our soil, on our water, and in the liver of our kids, and they stay there for a very long period of time.
And let me ask you one last question, maybe a politically incorrect question, but Health Secretary of the States, Robert J. Kennedy, is very controversial on the way he addresses some of the pharmaceutical problems. And he has recently sought to ban certain dye colors in food. Do you agree with those elements? What's your overall take on his efforts?
100%. There's no reason why we should use a chemical derived from oil to give food color. That is dumb. I'm sorry. It makes no sense. Why do we need the fruit punch to be bright red, fluorescent red, using something derived from oil? And that makes no sense. It doesn't add any value. It doesn't add any nutritional value. And all it does is it creates carbon in our environment. It's dumb. I agree with that wholeheartedly. Now, you have to be careful. right? You can't just say we should ban everything that we add to food. No, I mean, there are preservatives that are incredibly important, that extend the life of foods that are fundamental for people, right? You can't get rid of those. You can't get rid of things that protect our health. But we have to be a lot more measured on how we use things that are derived from fossil fuels. Let's leave the dinosaurs where they are, on their ground, where they belong. And let's figure out natural solutions to protect those foods, right? Let's figure out ways to promote the health of our kids without using any of this artificial nonsense.
And that says fertilizers are also an area that could be changed?
Yeah, ultimately, fertilizers promote yield in crops. And that yield has been lost because we've degraded the soil, and we've degraded the soil's ability to retain carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus because we're spraying all these chemicals. So over time, the use of these biological pesticides will actually regenerate the soil and regenerate its ability to retain nitrogen and phosphorus and carbon, and actually make the field much more productive again, right? So the beauty of RNA is that it is fully compatible with regenerative, no-till agriculture, which is ultimately where we want to get to.
Unfortunately, Andrey, we're running out of time. Thank you so much. This has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. I'm really excited about the role Mexico can play in food security for the world and obviously for Mexico and the Americas in general. I think it's an underreported story, and I certainly understand a lot more about it now and excited by what you're doing. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, gentlemen. My pleasure.
Well, thank you for joining Mex Moves, and hope you subscribe to our channel and come back next week.
Thank you, everyone. We hope to hear from you next week again.